Due to Ontario's guidelines, we are presenting these live streaming events in a virtual environment to keep everyone safer. We hope you will join us in the next several weeks. Please stay safe and stay well. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Watercourse Supply Road live streaming session. I'm Don Parkinson, consultation lead with SNC-Lavalin, who's doing the technical side of the environmental assessment and preliminary engineering. With me today as a special guest is Michael Fox, who's the project facilitator for the Watercourse Supply Road project. Mike, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have someone here at the desk with me for support and encouragement.
Yes, and good to be seen as well. I've never done this before, so we'll try this out with you on this important topic.
Well, this is the second in a series of 4 live streaming sessions that talk about what we call the study plans, which are effectively the work plans for the environmental assessment, the impact assessments. So this week we're going to talk about climate change and cumulative effects. Climate change, air quality, and cumulative effects, primarily climate change. And then next week, which would be March 24th, we're going to talk about water, wildlife, and aquatics. And then in week 4, our final week of this series, we're going to talk about human health and socioeconomic. So we've got a lot of information to get across in a short period of time. So we will get started. Mike, I think maybe before we start, we talk a little bit about climate change in general and help our viewers sort of understand what climate change is. So why don't we start from the top here? And
Sure.
Maybe you want to give a bit of a sort of a description about the warming trend associated with climate change, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, you hear in the news and social media, the debates around climate change and climate deniers and those that are warning, the planet about unequivocal scientific evidence of that. We live in a time where we have satellites now around the world with monitoring stations of all types globally, and with powerful computers that to do the calculations and the measures of various changes associated with the climate these days. So some of the things that they've measured are global temperatures. I think the global temperatures are at 2.12%. In the last since the 19th century. Most of that probably in the last 40 years. Of that rise, and I think the hottest year was in the last 4 years, in 2016, 2020. So it's unequivocal around the global temperatures. The other evidence around climate change is the ocean warming. So with the infrareds coming in from the sun, and the ocean actually absorbs a lot of the heat. In I think it's the first 100 meters of the ocean surface. So it absorbs about 90% of the heat the Earth absorbs through its oceans. The others are glacial retreats on mountain ranges. So you think of the famous Alps or Andes or Alaskas or even the ones in Africa, they're retreating. The ice caps around
shrinking glaciers.
Yeah. Decreased snow caps on both northern and southern hemisphere. You see that in the news where I think the Antarctica cracked last week. There was pictures of that. Other evidence.
You see these calving of icebergs and
yes,
things like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sea level rises. I think it's risen 8 inches, I believe, in the past decades. As well as declining Arctic sea ice. And with that, I mean, I think, with social media, we're getting, pretty accurate descriptions of extreme events like weather events So we're not here to debate whether climate change is happening or not. It's pretty, the scientific consensus is it's happening.
Yeah, it takes so many different forms too, Mike, and also extreme events. And I know when we talk to community members, quite often we hear a lot of community members saying, that they've never seen anything like this before, right, in their lifetime, and they've never seen winds like this, or rain like this, or hail, or so these extreme events play a big role in this. I mean, there's and you were talking about the carbon dioxide that's taken up by the ocean, and that causes acidification of the oceans and changes the whole habitat, or can change the habitat, gradually anyway. So there's some pretty, like you said, there's a lot of, sort of irrefutable evidence of it. And as a result, this has become a major consideration when doing an environmental assessment now. Yes. So climate change is a major consideration when we're undertaking our work, and we'll get into that a little bit more as well too. So
I think on the community level as well. I mean, in my own community of Winnets First Nations, I mean, and others around the Hudson Bay lowlands, they saw, they see the gas methane. That's sort of that's part of the permafrost, yes, which is melting, is now releasing, yes, into the air, or you see bubbles coming up in the water bodies.
Yeah. No,
stuff like that. So those are recent observations from Indigenous members in those communities.
Well, and as well, Mike, winter roads too, right? I mean, what we've been hearing for a number of years now is the winter road season has been shortened significantly, and many people point to climate change for that, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because you might have a longer spell now of warmer weather that is, to the extent that it has to close, the road has to remain closed for longer periods of time, or it just remains closed for the rest of the season. So we hear this a lot, don't we? And that has significant impacts on remote communities, doesn't it?
That's very true.
It's difficult to get goods into communities. It's and there's more reliance on air travel as a result. So yeah, so greenhouse gases, if we want to go back to greenhouse gases, just to give our viewers an idea of what some of these are, they could include water vapor. That's the most abundant greenhouse gas. It could also include carbon dioxide. That's the one that we hear about the most. And sources of carbon dioxide are, of course, burning of fossil fuels. So you look at communities that rely on diesel generators, that's burning fossil fuels, right? So there's a lot of carbon dioxide created from that, and that all these greenhouse gases like water vapor and nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide and methane, as you mentioned, these serve as ways to prevent the release of heat from the earth. So I guess the best way to describe it is, Mike, is the heat from the earth can't be vented. Mm-hmm. There's no way for it to escape, or there's fewer ways for it to escape. So as a result, the earth itself heats up, and it causes all kinds of these problems that we got into before. So these are significant impacts. So that gives, I think, hopefully gives people an idea of what greenhouse gases are and the greenhouse effect. Now let's talk a bit about carbon sinks. Carbon sinks are basically where carbon is stored. So if we look at plants or vegetation, they store carbon. Soil stores carbon as well. So these, on our particular project, we have activities that remove vegetation to create the corridor. So that's a removal of vegetation. So there is a bit of an impact there. And then we have a section which runs through the James Bay lowlands. So there might be a small impact, hopefully as minimal an impact as possible, on the peatlands. Peat stores carbon. It's a carbon sink. That's where carbon collects. So that sort of hopefully gives our listeners an idea of, and viewers an idea of what carbon sinks are. They're traps for carbon. So maybe now we can move on to our study plan, the climate change and air quality study plan a bit, and maybe give our viewers an idea of really what the purpose of the study plan is. And it's really quite simple, isn't it, Mike? I mean, there's two points that we're looking at when it comes to the purpose of the study plan, isn't there?
Yes. Basically, it's essentially to assess the impact of the Watercourse Supply Road project on the climate change and the atmospheric environment. I mean, that's one. And then assessment of the impact of climate change on the Watercourse Supply Road.
Yeah.
Those
so
are the
it's
two.
The project on climate change and climate change on the project, essentially. So it's that's really what we're investigating here. Now, in terms of the expectations of the study plan, it's it's to look at and predict greenhouse gases emitted as a result of the project, and what would the impacts be on carbon sinks as well. It's to look at how vulnerable and resilient or tough the project and its adjacent sort of environment, the ecosystem around the project, to these changing conditions. And then finally, what would be the expected production of criteria air contaminants? So key contaminants like maybe some of the greenhouse gases we were just talking about, and toxic contaminants, what would be the contribution from the project to that? And then the other thing I guess we'll get into a little bit later on is sometimes by building a project, there's a net improvement in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So I guess the example I look back to is if we were to create a corridor for a all-season road, there might be less air travel, right? Air travel has a lot of greenhouse gas emissions associated with it through the burning of jet fuel. And then, for example, if you took that corridor and put power lines through that corridor, and all of a sudden remote communities were off diesel generators, they wouldn't be burning the fossil fuels because they would be using hydroelectricity, presumably. So, it's all about looking at contribution versus savings long term. So that's really, what this work is looking at, trying to do those calculations, right?
And what makes it difficult is it's intangible in many people's way. It's hard to touch and feel something when it's so embedded in the immediate environment, and
so true.
and it's so almost indetectable.
Yep.
Any releases of carbon sinks or what have you, any emissions around that, and then trying to calculate the interactions of all the moving parts, both natural and the road itself. So it's a very sophisticated assessment.
It is. That's a good way to describe it, I would say. And maybe if we can get into it a little bit more specifically and talk about greenhouse gases and carbon sinks, what the work plan will be doing is providing a description of the main sources of emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions. So we'll get into that a little bit more specifically and give examples so people can understand what those might be. And again, as we were talking about, it's trying to estimate what those emissions might be. So we're, like you said, we're looking at, okay, the road would be, built using this kind of equipment, and during the construction phase, there would be this amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and then during operations, there would be this many vehicles on the road, with this many emissions associated with each one of them. So looking at that contribution, and then there might be a description of large sources of emissions that might occur as a result of an accident or a malfunction. Because these things happen sometimes. So trying to sort of anticipate these things that might happen. And then looking at carbon sinks. providing a qualitative description of so what do we think in words, not necessarily, quantifying or putting a number to something, but what might be the effects on carbon sinks? Yes, there might be an immediate effect in terms of deforestation to create the corridor. There might be a small effect on the peatlands that you're building the road through if some of the peat has to be disturbed in some way, which may not be the case in our situation because we're building a floating road, but we'll get into that in a minute. And again, like I was talking about, that sort of balancing act between, what the impact of the project, but is there a net benefit from the project? Is there a net benefit or a net loss in terms of emissions, for example? So there's all those things to think about. Maybe the best way to look at this, to help our viewers follow this, maybe is to talk a bit about the road going through the James Bay lowlands, Mike. We had a discussion a few weeks ago in one of our streaming sessions with John Cooper about where he did a voiceover of an animation that our team put together, and that animation described how the road would be built through the James Bay lowland areas, because of course these are particularly sensitive areas for a lot of different reasons. One of them being the potential for release of carbon into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide from disturbance to the peat. So our team did this animation, and we have, I believe we have John Cooper, our water resources engineer, on the line. John, are you on the line there?
Hi, Mike.
Okay, it sounds like we got you there, John. John, I thought what we would do today is maybe look at that animation that was put together, and then Michael and I will ask you some questions on that animation to look at maybe how climate change fit into the preliminary design that we're going to see in the animation. So, are you ready for some questions?
Sounds good, Don.
Okay, so let's have a look at that animation, and we'll come back, and Michael and I will ask some questions.
Organic material from the road alignment. A geogrid will be placed on the existing ground, followed by a level of gravelly material to sort of build up the road to the preferred grade. On top of that, a secondary geogrid will be placed, followed by a final road topping. This will allow the road to sort of float on top of the muskeg. In addition, culverts will be placed as needed to allow drainage to go back and forth, surface water drainage. Subsurface or groundwater will continue to flow naturally, as the road shouldn't impede the flow. And there's the final road topping there, and that is how we will construct the road.
Okay, we're back. We've got John Cooper, our water resources engineer, with us. Mike, you and I have seen that animation a number of times. Do you have any questions for John, maybe, about what we saw there and how it ties in with climate change?
I think what's important for the viewers is understanding the terrain. For those that don't understand the terrain, a large portion of this road is off what they call the Canadian Shield in the Hudson Bay lowlands, and so the Hudson Bay lowlands is how would you describe the Hudson Bay? Mostly
Bogs and
bogs,
fens.
peats, and, yeah.
People might call them swampy or wetland areas.
Wetland areas and stuff like that. So the idea for the road is this floating concept of a road. Typically, you see road construction all over Ontario or Canada. They have these foundations that they built, and in that foundations, wherever the bedrock is, and they have layers, and then they actually put the road on top with with the ditches and stuff associated with that. That's what we see on the highways. For those that are either expanding it, twinning highways, or they're creating new ones. wherever you are in Northern Ontario, you see all kinds of constructions around that. This road won't be like that. It's actually a different design. Just because of that terrain in the far northern Ontario. So John, just with that description, part of that animation, if I can remember, is this thing called a geogrid. Maybe you could explain what the purpose of that is.
Yeah, so kind of just to touch on what you're describing, the James Bay lowlands. It's pretty flat too. I think that's a key contributor too. So water basically accumulates and sits there and eventually dissipates, but very slow moving. So the point of the geogrid is, as you mentioned, the foundation of this road is not competent. It's spongy, it's boggy. If you step in it, you could sort of sink down, right? And I mean, there's tons of photos out there from Northern Ontario where you see dump trucks or excavators just sinking. Like I've seen photos of big heavy equipment just fully submerged in this material. So it literally can't hold anything up. So the point of the geogrid is kind of like a snowshoe effect. So what it does, it's a plasticky material, almost like a ski fence type material or fencing, plastic fencing you'd see. And it distributes the weight across a much larger area. So you put it down, then you build sort of your typical road foundation material on top of that, and then another layer of geogrid, more rock material, and then sort of your final road topping. And it acts as a way to, if it starts to settle in one spot, the whole road sort of holds itself together from a foundation to support itself. So it's exactly like you would see a snowshoe. So it distributes a person's weight over a much larger footprint, so you don't sink as much as you normally would.
So John, in terms of, we talk about this being a floating road. So I mean, in terms of climate change, it really probably involves minimal disturbance to the peat, does it, in terms of construction?
Yeah, and that's sort of one of the criteria. Once we realized how much peat there was, so there's obviously an engineering perspective where you from an engineering perspective, you don't want to disturb the peat because it's just a very difficult material to work with. But then when you factor in the environmental considerations, it makes the design that much more important. As you mentioned earlier, the peat actually acts as a bit of a carbon sink. So if you start disturbing that and excavating and removing all that, you're actually releasing a lot of greenhouse gas that you probably don't want to. So the design sort of works well from an engineering perspective, but also complements the not disturbing the environment as much as possible.
So it's really more of a climate change friendly approach to road building, isn't it?
In this particular instant, yes. I mean, I wouldn't say that a geogrid would be appropriate where, in other environments, but given that there's a lot of peat there, it certainly does. It's an environmentally friendlier option, of course.
And then on, from what I'm just trying to think of other climate change elements that have been considered in road design. And what about for drainage, John? I mean, this subject intimately, and about some of the considerations that were looked at in terms of the road design. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the water-related considerations.
Yeah, so the water considerations are more looking at, and you guys touched on this, more looking at the effects climate change will have on the road, opposed to what greenhouse gas emissions will be released as the result of the road construction and usage. So from a water perspective, there's 26 watercourse crossings for this proposed road, and they range anywhere from large bridge structures to relatively small culverts, right? So the water catchments that feed these crossings are anywhere from a square kilometer to 1,000 square kilometers. So they range greatly in size. So with that, you want to design the culvert to pass a certain flow. But then when you factor in climate change, you might want to make that opening a little bit larger. So, because we know with climate change, there's an increased temperature, more solar radiation, more heat days, all that sort of stuff. Which, from a water perspective, you can anticipate a larger effect on sort of intensity and duration of rainfall events. So, you can size your road crossings to work for today's climate, which is perfect. But if you want the road to last, 50, 100 years, if you want to actually make your investment worth it, you want it to last, be more robust and last beyond that, right? So looking at different climate change models, we can kind of anticipate, what future flows might look like. And then you can make your culverts and your openings a little bit bigger, so your road can now sort of handle increased rainfall if it needs to. I mean, if climate change doesn't, come to fruition to the extent that scientists say, then worst case is you've over-designed your culverts and, not a big deal, right? But worst case is you undersize it, you get more rainfall, more intense flood, and now you potentially wash out your road. So increased maintenance, or heaven forbid, you need that road in an emergency and now it doesn't work. So, I mean, that's sort of where the engineering fits into the climate change discussions, particularly around water.
John, I suppose road height too has something to do with it as well too. I mean, if you're anticipating maybe water levels potentially to be rising, right? You would, in the design, the height of the road has probably been raised as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand with your water crossings, but in particular with some of your larger water crossings, or say to get to the main community of Webequie, which is on an island, you want to look at what potential water levels could be in the future of the lake, right?
What about increased erosion at the water crossings, John? I'm just thinking, you get the scouring effect from higher flows. I know, and like you've traveled all over northern Ontario. When you see a culvert pipe, quite often there is some small riprap stone that's around the pipe. Would there be maybe more of that sort of armoring or protecting of pipe openings that would occur?
I mean, you could. I mean, it's culvert design is a sort of intimate balance between, the size of the opening and the velocities and the flows. So certainly you have more flow, larger culvert, you could potentially have more velocity. So yeah, definitely you'd want to size your culvert to, an increased flow, as a result of climate change, and then your corresponding riprap size would be adjusted as well. So I guess yes is your answer.
What about maintenance?
Yeah, I was going to ask that.
What do you think about maintenance, Mike?
Is there anything specific in this road design that'd be different from sort of mainstream roads, like in terms of operation and maintenance?
No, I mean, I'm just trying to think. You kind of caught me off guard. Like, I can't really think of anything. I mean, you have your crossings that you'd have to maintain, and you'd have to, after a large rain event, to go and make sure they're not plugged, or, to make sure there's no sediment buildup, to make sure they're still functional. I mean, I guess if we're talking just sort of increased runoff and increased rain, and sort of more intense rainfalls occurring more frequently, with a gravel road, you might have a bit more maintenance in terms of just grading it and, filling potholes and rills and that sort of stuff. So, I mean, that's sort of, I guess, all infrastructure across, the globe in general would likely have more maintenance due to, seeing more precipitation and seeing, hotter days and, cracking of the road and that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's probably more maintenance that will be required as a result of climate change.
And I guess with gravel roads too, I mean, if you have increased, if you've got more extreme events, let's say higher wind speed events, you could also get wind erosion too, right? Since they're gravel roads, you get more dust, etc. There's all those kinds of issues, I suppose, eh?
Yeah, that's always a possibility. I mean, a lot of that, not necessarily with the wind, but you can mitigate in the design, which is why it's critical to have, these conversations during the designing phase, right? And this is why it's important to have climate change considerations in your EA, because then you account for them and design for them and plan for them now, opposed to retroactive. Once the road's built, it's like, oh crap, it's this culvert gets washed out every 5 years. Like, what do we do? Well, now you got to go back and rebuild, and it's an expense, and it's more environmental effects. So it's appropriate to have the conversations now, which is what the team's been doing.
And I guess, John, like when you look at the situation where you've got a road running across these James Bay lowlands, you've got to anticipate both the more extreme events that might, for example, raise water levels, and then whether that project might actually exacerbate or make worse like an extreme event coming from climate change too. So you're really looking at, you got to look at the big picture, right? When you do this, like this project in place might cause these effects. They might magnify climate change effects. So you've got to be able to compensate for that in other ways as well, I suppose, eh?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And one, I mean, you guys sort of touched on it earlier, was the emissions released during construction and during operation sort of play into the overall larger global issues.
Yes.
So it's how you can possibly mitigate that on a project scale, right?
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of the problem with these types of projects is, well, it's just one project. The emissions aren't that much, which may be true, but the cumulative effect of this project and another project and a project in the States, it's the sort of the global perspective. All these things cumulatively add up. So if you can recognize that your little project on the grand scheme of climate change does have an effect and an impact, then you can kind of sit down and say, okay, well, how can we mitigate that? Or as you guys mentioned, like, what are the pros and cons, right? Like, yes, the road might generate X amount of greenhouse gas, which contributes to whatever the climate effect would be, but the offshoot of that is less air travel, the potential future for the removal of diesel generators, right? So so you can look at the climate pros and cons, right? Sort of the balance of that. And I mean, and then you can you kind of go down the rabbit hole and then look at the socioeconomics and sort of the quality of life and the pros and cons for all that. So you can kind of take anything and spiral it out. So the hard part with the climate change is really keeping things in perspective and sort of really identifying the grassroots issues. So you don't get it caught up with, well, this versus that versus, you kind of want something that, as Mike said, you can actually try to keep things tangible and try to keep things relatable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. No, that's really helpful, John. Thanks for sharing your insights on that. I think that example actually really communicates to our viewers the kinds of things that we consider, doesn't it, Mike?
Yeah, from a proponent's point of view, I think I think most folks looking at this project, they come from their perspective,
Yes.
right? They see the changes happening out there, and I guess the term is climate adaptation. How do we adapt to that as a community and land users, etc. But at the same time, as a proponent, we equally need to know that, for the design purposes of this road.
Yeah.
So it's not something secondary to any other studies. It's actually a very important set of assessments that we have to do, not just because there's a regulatory requirement, but it's actually for the design of the road, so that we can, as John was saying, plan.
Yes.
For any eventualities associated with climate change. Very good point.
And design a road that is sustainable, right? And that is resilient and is durable, which in the long run is controls the cost of maintenance as well too, right? So no, that's really helpful, John. Thanks for chipping in and joining us as always. Maybe now, Mike, we can talk a bit about some real life examples of direct greenhouse gas emissions from the project, just so people have an idea of, okay, where would these be coming from at different stages of the project. So maybe if we look at the construction phase of the project, you know, what might be some sources? Well, vegetation clearing. I talked about this a bit before, right? It's the vegetation is a carbon sink, but maybe something like heavy machinery too, right? Use of heavy machinery.
Yeah, anything that has emissions, you know, in the construction phase, pre-construction and construction phase, even the operation phase is taken into consideration around that. So from loaders to graders to any other dozer, any type of heavy equipment is taken into consideration in the modeling of that. There, you know, even at the aggregate sources or operations that are required, you know, for the road, that's taken into consideration as well. Even the passenger vehicles or shuttles that are being used for the camps are taken into considerations. So like any drilling, you know, geotechnical drilling that have to do.
Blasting too, explosives,
Blasting,
right?
it's a very
Use
good
of
one, yes.
explosives.
Power sources, most communities are done by diesel generators, so that's another factor in the calculations when it comes to climate change or emissions associated with climate change.
And then even, you know, as you mentioned in operations phase, you look at the number of vehicles using the road per day, right? A certain number of emissions, and project what the emissions would be from the project. Maintenance vehicles, I mean, any kind of effort associated with maintenance has emissions associated with it too, right? So that's another consideration. Maybe now we'll talk a little bit about some of the other considerations in terms of, I think maybe if we can find our table, Mike, that we were going to talk to, looking at different climate variables and how they might impact project components. So climate variables associated with climate change might be things like temperature extremes, right?
Yes.
So extremely high temperatures, extremely low temperatures, and then duration of those, but also precipitation, right? Rain in the form of rain.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a pretty avid reader, a pretty consistent reader, and you know, different readings I do, and when you read about you know, the early days of Canada, and how cold it was, you know, their descriptions of 40, 50 degrees was like the normal, and in certain areas of Canada, especially with the Hudson Bay company that took very detailed notes, day-to-day notes around that, and that's not the case anymore. You know, we're actually surprised when we hit 45, 50 degrees below zero these days. So, you know, temperature extremes today, you know, whether extreme heat or extreme cold in the same year is taken into consideration as well.
Let's look at things like snow. I mean, you know, amount of snow per year. I mean, that snow turns into water at some point too, right? When the seasons change, or sometimes during a thaw period. So, you know, that snow load can result in a water load ultimately, right? And if it happens a lot all at the same time, you get extreme events like flooding as well too. Then what we call inclement weather, which could be extreme wind gusts, things like hailstorms, right? Big hailstorms, and then ground conditions. So changes to groundwater can actually have changes to road infrastructure. So let's talk about some of the project components like watercourse crossings. These are the project components that might get impacted by these extreme conditions. Maybe you want to talk about the watercourse crossings and the impacts to them.
Like I say, again, there's all kinds of watercourse crossing, basically bridges, right? It's structures that we cross. So that'll be taken into consideration based on the assessment and field studies. On the banks, you know, the type of banks, how wide, the water flows and levels in the different seasons, And there's watering stations, gauges, throughout northern Ontario. So there's some historical data that's drawn to help with that modeling. Sort of materials, like the material selection, like the type, whether, it could be a wooden Bailey bridge, in some cases to, a two-laner, for bigger trucks, or even, in the winter road, they had to widen it a couple of years ago because of the prefab housing going around the corners. They had to actually widen the winter road. So the type of vehicles, the type of use, are all taken into consideration when it comes to watercourse crossings. The foundations, the footings, how much maintenance. These are all typical things that are taken into consideration with Ministry of Transportation, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
Every year they assess which bridges have to be maintained, what are repaired, or if not replaced. They have 5-year plans. This is going to be just exactly the same. As, designing the water crossings, and then looking forward, what type of operations and maintenance are required for those type of based on the climate, typical in that region. Again, we're back to climate change, and not that long ago, was it 3 weeks ago in Texas?
That's right.
They had a snowfall, and I don't know how many car pileups or accidents that have happened, but they weren't ready for it.
It was a crisis.
It was
They
a
weren't
crisis.
ready at all. That's a great example. Mike, we actually just got a question via Facebook, and the question is, Supply Road, is it just for the industry to use, or will it be open to the public?
It's a good question. So at this point in time, the purpose of the Supply Road is an economic development road. It actually starts at the Webequie Airport, and it's 117 or 107 kilometers to the proposed mine developments and exploration activities. So the idea of an economic development road for Webequie Supply Road is to move people, supplies, materials from Webequie to the activities associated with the mineral exploration and mining. In the event that another project, known as the Northern Road Link, there may be possibilities there around a multi-purpose road, not necessarily just a economic development road, but actually getting connected to the provincial highway. How that roads will be regulated is a different question, and it will be there's different types of roads in Ontario, right? We have provincially defined highways, we have winter roads, and we got resource roads such as forestry and mining roads. So we have forestry roads all over the place in Northern Ontario, and an example of a mining road, of course, is just north of Pickle Lake. The big section of that road that a lot of First Nations use is actually Musselwhite's road that they self-regulate and self-maintain and everything. So it all depends later what the ownership and type and how the road will be governed. We're just not there yet. We're actually doing these studies to generate information for the leadership and membership of Webequie First Nations to make an informed decision later. So once all the information's in about the environmental effects, the mitigation measures in place, and then we take that information and then bring it back to the community leadership and members, and then they'll make a decision, whether to go forward or not, based on the effects and benefits of the project as a whole.
That's great. Thank you, Mike. Let's go back now to the table we were discussing. So we were looking at different climate variables, and then like what if scenarios. So for example, if we looked at, maybe I'll do the first one here, Mike, precipitation, rain. So if we had a higher intensity of rain, meaning a higher amount of rain within a certain period, or a shorter return period for those high intensity storms, what would the impact be, and what project component would get affected? So let's take the example that you were talking about with the water crossings. So what are the potential hazards to the project, or the consequences of events like that? So if the crossings weren't sized properly, this could lead to the roadway overtopping, right? Flooding of the roadway, making the roadway sort of impassable, so you couldn't get through there. It could cause road failures or blowouts, where a segment of the road just gets completely washed away by water. So, that's why all these things really do need to be considered. As John talked about just a couple of minutes ago, you have to sort of consider these kinds of extreme events in your design. Otherwise, you're going to have things like this happen. Who wants to build a road if it's not going to be open very often? I mean, it's got to be done properly. So these things can be what you call mitigated or controlled, or the impacts can be minimized in different ways. So these are all the kinds of things we're thinking about. Maybe we'll look at what's another what if scenario, Mike. How about maybe I can do groundwater levels. If we talk about groundwater levels, we don't see groundwater, so we don't really think about it that much. But if there are changes to groundwater levels as a result of climate change, that can change the sort of the structural integrity, I guess, of the strength of the material that the road is sitting on. So it could cause that foundation that the road sits on could get affected. So that can have impacts. But maybe things like inclement weather. Maybe you might want to talk about inclement weather, like wind gusts and things like that, Mike.
These things are just, what you're talking about is Mother Nature and its forces, right? And so, I mean, water, anybody who's been on the four main rivers of Northern Ontario, the Severn River, the Winnis River, the Attawapscot River, Albany River, these are powerful, mighty rivers. And all the secondary and tertiary water ways associated with that. So, anybody who's seen a breakup of those rivers will show you just what water can do. Very thick ice, several feet, it just crack because of the flowing river, and then bring in these huge pieces of ice that tons in weight, just moving along. So if it can do that, water can really destroy a road if not built in that environment, right? Of course, there's other forces of Mother Nature, like extreme gusty winds. Anybody who's been on the Hudson Bay coastline, that's a constant. If you're up there for a day or two outdoors, you actually get windburn because the wind is just constant. So like wind gusts is another extreme gust. Is another force of nature that's taken into consideration. That can lead to dust issues. Loss of road topping. So like the maintenance of this road, it could blow off. The topping of the road. So all that. The air quality studies we're doing, that's all part of it. This integration of all the data sets to help formulate the road design and its calculations around that, both in the development and the operations of the road. I think the other one's snow. I mean, you can't avoid snow. Snow. It's been a while. We were just talking about this on the weekend. Like, when was the last huge snowfall in Thunder Bay? And I think it was in the 90s. I remember shoveling. I forget how many feet it was, but I remember shoveling the driving out. It took me like 4 or 5 hours. It was that much snow, and so like trying to design it for snow the annual, monthly, the participation around snow, the intensity, the frequency around that. for snow removal purposes, right, and maintenance and all that kind of stuff, especially for the plowing, as well as public safety issues.
Yes.
You know, like we're, we all drive the highways, and without the right signage or without the right speeds, it's if you go too fast, if it's a 90-kilometer highway, and then you're going 90 on an icy road, it's not a good idea. So that's part of the public safety, and communities. They're always thinking of community safety. So that's going to be an important part as well in designing the road, is the participation levels with snow, as well as for operations purposes.
Well, even looking at rain too, these extended wet periods, you can, when it comes to roads, you could end up in situations where you have, a lot of pooling up against the road or on the road, and these hazards that are created can cause the road to not be usable, really, right? So,
Yeah.
these extreme events can have significant impacts on operations of the road. I think, Mike, the next thing I'd like to talk about is maybe is input from community members when it comes to climate change. I think this is important part of an environmental assessment, Mike. I've had many conversations with community members where they share their observations. Many of them are elders, right? So maybe you could talk a bit about that, because I'm sure you've had similar conversations.
Yeah, especially the land users and hunters and harvesters, etc. Like they know, they've seen the changes in their lifetime, and whatever that's 50, 60 years old, sometimes even younger. Like they've seen the changes. It's almost imperceptible, on a year-to-year basis, but over time, our collective memories and talking about. Like I just did. When was the last major snowfall in Thunder Bay? It was 1990s, and that's what I remember because I had to I had to snow it out. But they would remember too. Probably colder days, right? Especially the winter road usage is probably probably one of the key indicators. The shorter season to the shorter number of weeks. For its usage, the maintenance of it, upkeep of it is probably another indicator. The other thing, like I mentioned earlier, was the methane gas that's being released because of climate change. What you can do about that, when it's on a global thing, with a road or not a road, it doesn't matter what project or no project, that stuff's happening.
Yes.
But people are thinking about climate adaptation associated with that, and people are trying to bring awareness about those direct observations on the land. I think what's also happening is you have different species, different birds coming up, new mammals are in the area because it's warmer, and some species of birds and animals not around or not seen as frequently, going maybe further north or.
So true. We hear the stories, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
No, that I think you brought up some interesting points there, Mike. And one thing I can say is community members, they're hunters and fishermen and gatherers, and they rely on this for for their food, right? And because they rely on it, it's so important to them. They're acutely aware of weather, right? So these stories about weather changes that we hear from community members are paying attention because they have to,
Yes.
right? Because in order to effectively and efficiently hunt and fish and gather, they need to be aware of these things. So I think that's why, when we're talking to community members, it's really important to listen and report what we hear, I think, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I think the other example in Webequay just recently was the number of caribou. how close they were to the community and the number within the herds that are associated with that. And you know, for some of them it was shorter hunting, but it was an observation that was shared with us, if you can remember.
Yes.
I think some of them went right through the community, if I can remember.
Yes, that's right. And I've heard stories myself, Mike, from Webequie community members about, you know, that they may have been able to access areas that they hadn't accessed in years because of higher water levels in certain areas, right? So they've been able to go fishing further upstream in a certain area by boat because they could access them. Then you hear the opposite as well too, some years, right? So I think a key part of the climate change work on the environmental assessment is talking to community members, isn't it? And taking that information, because there's a lot of value to it, because community members have to pay attention to the weather. You know when you visited your community and gone out into the field with your relatives, right? Going hunting, you noticed how acutely they are aware of the weather, right?
They're in touch with the micro rhythms of the environment, and you know, when it's too dangerous, or if it's the right moment to move upriver, or to go out, or if it's geese hunting, or what have you. They know the landscape, they know the weather patterns, right? They know animal behavior, and they take that all in consideration. So weather, climate is, you know, climate being the background, you know, weather being the more immediate,
Yes.
but they see the
Yes.
patterns over time.
Yeah,
you know,
very
so.
true. Very true. Well, we've almost used up all of our time, Mike.
Oh,
and
that went by pretty quick.
yeah, it did, didn't it? And I think we had a good conversation today about climate change. Unfortunately, we weren't able to talk about cumulative effects, but we'll try and squeeze that into our next two sessions. As I said, this is the second of our series of 4 streaming sessions. Next week, Mike, we're talking about water, wildlife, and aquatics. So again, we got a lot of real estate to cover in that. That's again, you know, we just run out of time, don't we? There's so much to talk about. And then week 4, which is March 31st, same time, 12:30 to 1:30, we'll be talking about another giant topic, a couple of topics, human health and socioeconomics, which is a big one. So we're going to be here for a couple more weeks in this series. We hope you found this helpful. I think we try to explain climate change to you so you can see it on a practical level, and don't hesitate to contact us at any time through our website, supplyroad.ca, and through social media at hashtag supplyroad, Mike?
WFN Supply Road.
Thank you. That's good. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Michael, for joining us, and John Cooper, our water resources engineer, for chipping in and talking a bit about climate change. And we will see you again next Wednesday, March 24th, 12:30 p.m. Don't miss it. Thanks everyone, and we'll talk to you next week.
Be rich.